the mouse if you prefer, or just click the...
Can I just, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. 3 minutes.
Will you introduce me, or just introduce myself?
No, I can introduce you if you want.
Either way.
I guess I'm more nervous than you are.
What's that?
I guess I'm more nervous than you are.
You really don't like talking in front of people.
Huh?
You don't like to talk in front of people. Louis.
I'm getting old, so I have to come up front.
I'll talk loud for you older people.
It's nice to have new technology.
I know. Compared to my old phone, it's extremely new technology.
I think you can begin.
Is the recording is going?
Yeah.
Okay.
But after you cut it.
Oh, okay.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to this CEF conference. So I would like to introduce you Brian Voigt, who is a research professor at the Gunt Institute for Ecological Economics at the University of Vermont. So Brian is interested in land-use changes, and he is also a lead developer of the ARIES modeling platform. So he uses ARIES to estimate the provisioning of ecosystem services to human beneficiaries, and also to assess how it is being used by beneficiaries. It's also a great platform to analyze, or it has potential to analyze the trade-offs between different ecosystem services. So Brian is going to present the approach of ARIES and present also a couple of case studies around the world. So.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks for introducing me in English so I know what you said about me. Can everyone hear me? I can wear a headset if that would make it easier, maybe. Does this work? Better? Whoa, that's loud. And now I look funny, so you can have that to make fun of me about. Okay, so as Anthony said, I'm a research professor at the University of Vermont. I work in the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics, and I spend most of my time playing with computers, building models, and studying the interaction between humans and the environment. Today I'm going to talk about a couple of different modeling applications. Just a quick show of hands. How many folks in here work with computer models? Okay, so some of this will be pretty new to many of you. That's great. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt me and ask. I understand maybe the English to French translation in your head might not be as fast as I talk. So, with that, thanks everyone for coming out this morning. I wanted to start with this first slide that, whoa. That's it, thanks for coming. Maybe working with batteries. I'll try to talk loud while we look for other batteries. So, this first slide that I show you here has a real direct relationship to my work in that I build computer models for management and decision-making applications. And this, the content of this slide is taken from a paper by Bob Costanza and Matthias Ruth from the late 1990s, where they were looking at the role of computer models, simulation models, in the decision-making process. And we see we've got three different classes of models: the scoping models, research models, and management models. And I'll touch a bit on each of these today, but ultimately I'm attempting to build these models in the third class here, these management models. And so we see that as we move from the top of the slide to the bottom of the slide, that we increase our level of complexity, we increase the potential cost, both monetary and time, and we hopefully along the way increase the precision of the model outputs themselves. So scoping models are nice when you need a quick look at a system itself. So you're not necessarily focused solely on the outputs, but you're trying to capture the dynamics of the system through some sort of model parameterization. So you're building a quick model that can capture a snapshot of the system itself and give you an idea about how the system is functioning. As we move on down the line into research models, we try to build in a higher level of realism, potentially collecting field data that we apply in the place of other data sets that maybe are at a lower resolution. We begin with things like calibration and model testing, and then eventually we're hopefully able to pass these on to a management level model. So a model where we have a high enough level of confidence that we can insert the model into the decision-making process, again, with a high level of confidence and with the support of the management community, the different stakeholders that are interested in the issue at hand. Now, within the model framework itself, we typically like to build these models for the purpose of scenario analysis. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, when I'm talking about scenarios, I'm talking about altering one or more of the input conditions of the model itself to see what kind of effect it will have on the output of the model. And so we're talking about things like changing land use policies or environmental policies, different types of capital investments. Do we build a new road or a dam or some other type of power infrastructure? Economic and demographic changes, changes in the type of labor force within the community, or maybe there's an influx of people moving to a region because it's quite popular, or potentially even in some parts of the world, people need to leave their current place because they're being directly impacted by something like climate change. And then finally, we could also consider something like behavioral assumptions. So maybe we have a strong and coordinated education program to attempt to influence the way people behave. We can think about a recycling program, or where people choose to build a home. Is it really close to a river or in a floodplain? And we start with our base case here, so just the simple boxes on top. We have a set, again, of parameters that we supply to the model. We make some changes to one or more of those and run that through the simulation yet again to look at the differences in outcomes in the bottom here represented as differently shaded pixels. So all of that leads up to my first discussion here of ecosystem services. As Anthony mentioned, I work on a project called ARIES, the Artificial Intelligence for Ecosystem Services. And what I'm presenting here is a conceptual model of the way that we view ecosystem services throughout the world. We have 4 distinct components: sources, sinks, users, and flows, depicted in the graphic here on the right. So we can think of a source region as a location that generates some type of ecosystem service, a sink region as a place that detracts from the overall service itself. So we can think of water infiltration into the ground, for example. In terms of the users, we're talking about specific beneficiaries. So not just people in general, but farmers that need water for agriculture, households that need water for human health reasons or drinking water, and so on down the line. And then finally, this notion of flows, how the ecosystem service itself moves from the source location through one or more sinks and ultimately to the users themselves, the actual beneficiaries. And the last point I'll make with this slide is this notion of critical flow. So we see in the graphic on the right, I've got an area with a red oval surrounding a number of different flow paths that link the source and use locations. So in terms of critical flow, these are the places on the landscape where one or more services are transmitted in a volume or quantity such that they should be designated as a special location. So if we have identified where these critical flow paths are, where a large amount of an ecosystem service is moving through or across the landscape, from a management perspective, these are the locations we would want to protect. So if we're talking about visual analysis, looking at aesthetic beauty on the landscape, and we have a particularly nice viewpoint from a trail, and we can look out over a beautiful landscape itself, then maybe the best place for a high-rise building is not right in front of the viewpoint, which would then completely block or obstruct the view of the landscape itself. If we're talking about something like water that supplies drinking water to downstream users, the construction of a dam could directly impact the people that live downstream of that. So it's not necessarily the best idea to build or construct different types of infrastructure or other things in these locations because of the direct impact it would have on the downstream beneficiaries themselves. When we talk about flows, flows come in a number of different forms depending on the type of service we're studying or particularly interested in. So when we think about things like hydrologic services, they're going to follow the existing waterways for the most part, except maybe under flooded conditions. Something like aesthetic viewsheds or Scenic landscapes have a direct line of sight, so what you can see is what you can either benefit or lose out from. Things like carbon sequestration and some cultural values don't have a flow path like the first two examples. It's more like an existence value. Carbon sequestration benefits all of us. The existence of some sort of cultural icon, some cultural feature on the landscape, even though it's half the world away, is maybe something that provides me with some sort of benefit as well. In the picture in the center on the bottom, that's a picture of Central Park in New York City, but we can think about things like recreation or proximity to resources, and again, some cultural services where the further away from the resource that you are, the less of an ecosystem service you might derive from it. So if you live right next to Central Park, you benefit from the views, you benefit from the proximity to the park, and your property values might reflect that. The further away you get from the park doesn't mean you still can't use the park, but maybe it's a little bit more difficult, maybe the direct benefit is slightly lower. And then finally, over on the right-hand side, we have different sorts of pathways in terms of transportation networks that we might follow for a recreational activity or some type of flood regulation itself. Now, we put all of these together and have defined this framework for ecosystem services. And we start out on the left and we look at supporting services themselves. Now, supporting services we could consider as easy for ecologists to study, but nearly impossible to put some type of economic value on. So we're talking about things like the hydrologic cycle itself, ecosystem water needs, photosynthesis, these types of things that are fairly challenging for inclusion in some type of economic valuation. Moving over into the center, we can see something like the Millennium Assessment for Ecosystem Services. These are more of the intermediate type services, traditionally viewed as the ecosystem services, but not always easy to either conceptualize or value economically. And then finally, all the way over to the right, we're looking at, again, specific beneficiaries, the specific benefit that a person or a group of people would derive from a service itself. So moving from left to right, we're hopefully getting into an area where it's more easy, again, easy with the double quotes, for an economist to put an economic value on. So in this case, again, we're talking specifically about water for agriculture, water for electrical production, and so on down the line. But the closer we can align a service with a beneficiary group itself, the easier it becomes for us to relate that to some economic value of the service itself. So with that in mind, I'll give a couple of slides here of an overview of the ARIES system itself. Again, ARIES is a project that I've been working on for about 5 years. It's been going for about 7 or 8 years now, originally funded by the National Science Foundation and begun largely at the Gund Institute at the University of Vermont by Ferdinando Villa, the project lead. ARIES is the artificial intelligence for ecosystem services. It's not a model per se, it's a modeling platform. So what we're doing is designing a piece of software that we can use for ecosystem service analysis, but that allows people to make modifications to things like the model structure, the types of data that they use, and other things along those lines. Now, it's intended to be a rapid assessment toolkit for building these types of ecosystem service models themselves, where we can demonstrate a process for mapping the provision, the use, and the flow of different types of ecosystem services. And we feel that this is an advancement over many of the other types of platforms that look at similar topics, because they're typically looking only at the provision. So they're not necessarily making these connections between these source locations and use locations that I showed a couple of slides ago. we can use probabilistic or deterministic models to create this type of information that decision makers will need to look at the range of possible outcomes and have a better informed decision-making process. And because this is a software project that's in development, we've got long-range plans looking at things like adding a web-based component where you would not need to be a programmer or necessarily even an expert in ecosystem services. You'd be able to use something more like an interface, Google Maps or Google Earth, something that most people are familiar with and are able to navigate in order to set up and initiate a model run. With that in mind, we have goals like being able to customize the models for specific user groups or geographic areas, or even for addressing specific policy goals, such as how to respond to a changing climate, for example. Couple of technical slides before I get maybe more into the case study details here. We have what we consider are semantic annotations. So before we start the modeling process itself, we're looking to define a consistent set of terminology that can be applied to all of the models, regardless of your location in the world. And we can use these semantics to represent, again, either deterministic or probabilistic style models with many different types of potential model parameters, classifications. You can think of something like land cover data, measurements, how much rainfall hits the surface of the earth in a particular location, rankings, a good, better, best, for example. Currencies, could be money, could be something else as well, and then finally binary type inputs, a yes-no response to the presence or absence of a certain landscape feature. We can look at multiple different scales simultaneously, both spatial scales, temporal scales, and even structural scales in terms of the aggregation of model parameters or even the choice of variables that we supply to the model itself. And then finally, it's a multi-paradigm approach that can make use of things like agent-based models, process-based models, Bayesian networks, and even static GIS, among a number of other things. So a typical session workflow would look something like this. I wish it was this pretty. It's usually, you'll see in the next slide, a lot uglier than this. But I look at this slide to make myself feel better when I'm particularly struggling with something. It's supposed to be this easy. We have, on the user side, a user defining an area of interest, the ecosystem services they're focused on, the type of application that they're trying to build, and then access to things like a command line interface on the user desktop, and eventually a web interface that we'll be able to host for people that can log in remotely from anywhere in the world. Again, we build our knowledge through a combination of the ontologies, so the specific semantics of the model components that we desire for inclusion, and we use that to define the models themselves. Now, once we've got the model defined, we pass those annotations over to a network of different databases. And so we have, at present, 3 different server clusters, one located at the University of Vermont, one at the U.S. Geological Survey in Denver, and one at the Basque Center for Climate Change in Bilbao, Spain. And a single model can call on data from one or more of these databases all at the same time. So we built in this infrastructure to be able to reach out onto the web, onto the semantic web itself, and grab the different pieces of data, which is important for a number of reasons, but primarily it means that you don't need to store everything locally. You don't need to keep it all on your computer, and as long as you have a web connection, you can run a model from anywhere, and you're just pointing at these different data servers to pull down this information. Now, once you've got the data in place, you can assemble and train custom models, pass those models into the computation algorithm itself, and then observe different types of results, which eventually you could either visualize or pass to some other database for storage and further analysis. I promised you it wasn't as nice as that last graphic. It's not important if you can read the words here, but this is what the current version of the software interface looks like. And I direct you to the center box there. So this is the coding piece. So if you were actually writing the code for one or more models, you would develop simply a text file that we can then pass to the computation algorithm, which you do simply by grabbing something from the left pane and dropping it in the bottom box that we see down there to yield something like this, where we have, in this case, I've simply defined my spatial context, the Great Ruaha River Watershed in Tanzania, and we can then continue to drop additional concepts down into the bottom box to observe any number of different types of data itself. On the right, we see our server connection. We see things like how far along in the process we're able to run. And we can run models and write code simultaneously, because some models, as you might expect, take quite a lot of time when we're moving water over a large landscape, for example. We're talking about models that could take 10 or 15 minutes up to an hour or a couple of hours. And so it's important that we can continue with working on other related tasks as the model run happens itself. Now, when we run a model from the interface, we get a list of outputs that, again, we can map in our center box that we see with the current image here. Or we can simply export those from the system and pass that to ArcGIS or QGIS for additional spatial analysis or for making pretty pictures for the decision makers themselves. So we typically follow this 5-step process when we're looking at ecosystem service modeling within the ARIES system, in that we collect spatial data, we identify our beneficiaries, the people that are that are directly benefiting from the service of interest. We identify how those services are moving, either through matter, energy, or information. Develop our probabilistic, deterministic, process-based models for our sources, sinks, and use. And then finally apply some type of a flow model, again, to make this connection between our source locations and our use locations. And I'll show you some examples here in the next 2 case studies that I discuss. So in the first example, I'm going to talk about some work that I'm doing in Tanzania on the Great Ruaha River Watershed, where we're looking at this interaction between surface water, pastoral livelihoods, and disease regulation. So in this particular landscape, it's a very remote and rural landscape where water is relatively scarce, and at certain times of year we have observed people, livestock, and wildlife all coming together, sharing single water sources themselves, and serving potentially as these hotspots for disease vectors to move across the landscape. So we're primarily interested in how much water people have access to, and whether an increase in fresh water supply would help to mitigate the spread of infectious diseases throughout the region. So I'm working with a number of different project collaborators from Sokoine University of Agriculture, the Aringo Water District, so the actual people that are tasked with managing the water supply of the region, as well as a non-governmental organization called the Friends of Ruaha. And finally, the funding for this project comes from the U.S. Agency for International Development. The map on the right is the gray polygon we see is the country of Tanzania. The red outline we see is the entire Ruaha River watershed, and if you're sitting close enough and squint a little bit, you can see that there's a yellow polygon inside of there that is the Great Ruaha River watershed itself. And so that's the study area that we're focused on. A little bit of background here in terms of what is going on within the system. Prior to 1993, the flow of the Great Ruaha River was perennial. It was flowing continuously throughout the entire year. By 2005, and these pictures are taken in the same location, by 2005, there were 119 days of no flow within the river. So, as you might imagine, that's quite problematic for people that live downstream of these locations that no longer have access to the freshwater resources that they depend on for their livelihoods. One of the reasons, or at least the suspected reasons, why this is happening is due to an increase in agricultural development in the upper portion of the watershed itself. And so if we look at the graphic on the right-hand side of the screen here, we can see a plot of the dry season flow at the Nsembe River gauge compared to the irrigated area within the Usangu Plains themselves. And I'll show a couple pictures of the locations of these features. But what we can see is a fairly clear trend line going down that indicates that the more irrigated agriculture that's occurring in the upper watershed, the lower the dry season flow itself and lower parts of the watershed. So here's a map of a couple of the key features of the landscape. In the bottom left corner, we see the Ihefu wetlands, so that blue patch in the bottom left corner of the left side map there. That's a large wetland complex that's been largely developed for agriculture through funding from international development agencies trying to help mitigate food shortages within the region. So on its face, this is a fairly tough set of decisions to make. We're talking about an impoverished area with a lot of issues surrounding hunger. So outside agencies came in to fund agricultural development. And what we see as a result is this graphic on the right that shows the change in the size, the change in the size of the wetland itself. So if we look in the light green, that's the polygon from the 1991. We delineated the wetland complex. It's about 320 square kilometers of this wetland area itself. By July of 2000, that's reduced by a little more than half to 153 square kilometers. And by 2006, only about 84 square kilometers of the wetland itself exists. Now, again, this is in large part because of agricultural development encroaching on the wetland complex itself. You're trying to grow agriculture in a dry area, it makes sense that you want to be really close to the water. The issue is that the importance of the Ihefu wetlands were never understood prior to this because it actually served as a sponge, and during the dry season, it would release all that water that it gathered throughout the rest of the year during the rainy part of the season and supply a continuous flow to the downstream locations. As a result of this reduction in flow, we can also see something like the decrease in the size of the Mtera Reservoir, so almost at the complete opposite end of the watershed itself. And we see a reduction from the mid-80s of 605 square kilometers down to about 170 square kilometers. Keep trying. Okay. Now, as a result of that change, we see a number of different things, primarily things like an increase in the conflicts between livestock and agriculture, increased grazing pressure, increased wildlife conflicts. With a reduced amount of water, we're bringing, again, people and livestock and wildlife all together. But we also see things like a decrease in tourism revenues because people don't want to come and look at dead animals in the national park. You don't want to go to safari and see these types of things. You want to see elephants walking around in the park. You want to be able to see more wildlife, but because of lesser availability of water, there's a decrease in wildlife, a decrease in water quality, potential reduction to the overall national economy, and we suspect an increase in the risk of infectious disease. So here's a conceptual model of the system itself. And I'll take a short step back here to say that when I begin a modeling project, I like to try to scope out how I think the system itself works. Because, well, for a number of reasons. We need to identify potential data sets that we can access, the kinds of parameters that we want to include in the model, and we want to define our understanding of the system itself before we translate that into some computer code that we can then run through some type of algorithm itself. So we've got things like our sources of water, including precipitation and the Ihefu wetlands themselves, our flow paths that move the water from the upstream to downstream location through streams and rivers, through the wetlands, eventually through the main river and all the reservoirs, and finally out into the Indian Ocean itself. We've got a number of different types of flow disruption, water being extracted for agricultural purposes that sometimes, but not always, makes its way back into the river system. Things like grazing, irrigation, draining and filling of smaller wetlands or areas adjacent to the main wetland complex. A number of different types of beneficiaries. I focused only on the left two in my project, households and agricultural production. And then a range of different ecosystem services, things like the provision of food and fiber, provision of fresh water supply, in terms of regulating services, things like water purification or even disease regulation. Now, I built, again, a series of models within the overall framework, and in this case, our source model represents simply the annual precipitation that falls within the region. This is a part of the world where there's not any snow. But in terms of our sinks, we look at things like soil infiltration and evapotranspiration, and the subpoints here are all the factors that we've identified that contribute to that. And then finally, a use model, again, in terms of residential use of water and their associated water rights, as well as the water demand for agricultural and livestock uses. I've been lucky to travel to Tanzania 2 different times to participate in this project. We kicked off the project in May of 2011 with a mediated modeling workshop where we brought together local experts to talk about the system and actually define that conceptual model graphic that I showed you a couple of slides ago. We returned in 2013 to present preliminary results and begin to discuss different types of scenarios that we could address with the overall model framework itself, and that's the work that's currently ongoing and will wrap up sometime before the end of the year. Now, in terms of the models themselves, I use, in this case, Bayesian belief networks. How many of you have worked with Bayesian inference, Bayesian statistics? A few of you? The rest of you are lucky. I'm not going to show you all the ugly guts of the model. Again, I show the pretty pictures and let your mind wander a little bit. But what we do is, if we had data for the top 2 nodes, so our soil infiltration class or our evapotranspiration class, if we had actual high-resolution data that we had some confidence in, we could simply use those data sets as the inputs to the model. In this part of the world, unfortunately, that's not the case. And so what we do is we build these Bayesian models. We think of different potential contributing factors that relate to something like soil infiltration or evapotranspiration, and we identify data that does exist that we can then use to parameterize these. What I don't show behind the scenes here are the conditional probability tables that then take these different inputs that we see on the lower levels and actually compute those into probabilities for different levels of evapotranspiration or different levels of soil infiltration in this case. And what we can use this simple graphic here to do is actually produce a set of maps. And I'll ask you to focus just on the left side here. Map A is a map of the watershed itself with different levels of sink. So the combination of evapotranspiration and infiltration produces a range of 0 to about 475 millimeters of water per hectare per year throughout the location. So the tan to yellow colors are quite low, with the blue colors representing the highest level of water being taken out of the system from natural causes. Now, in terms of agricultural use, we needed to get a better understanding of how much water the agricultural producers were actually using to grow their crops. And this was a very difficult thing to get a good handle on. And this is not a problem that's specific to Tanzania. It's also equally problematic, especially in the western part of the United States, where water is a highly contentious issue and a much coveted resource. But again, we didn't have an actual data layer that said, this is how much water agricultural producers are using throughout the region. And so what we did was identify things like the number of livestock on the landscape and how close those livestock were to water to make an estimate of the livestock needs for water consumption. And then also looked at where the irrigated agriculture exists. So from satellite imagery, from local knowledge, we were able to actually put those things on a map as well. And we used the water rights database to identify the legal amount of water extraction associated with agriculture, and then built in a buffer factor because it's estimated that the illegal use of water is potentially as high as 150% of the legal use of water within the system. And we can look then at, again, a series of maps that output the different types of water demand in the system. On the right-hand side, we see the result of our agricultural use model, again, ranging from 0 up to about 1,400 millimeters per hectare per year in some of the highly irrigated agricultural locations throughout the region. On the left, we see the residential water use, and we see a rough pattern, mostly highlighted there in yellow, that roughly mimics the road network in the region. So most of the people that live there live relatively close to roads or trail networks that are somewhat formalized. Now, in terms of the flow outputs themselves, we had our precipitation as our source. We've got our evapotranspiration and infiltration as our sinks. We've identified the location of our different users, as I showed in the last graphic. And then we look at the actual flow dynamics of moving the water through the system. And so what I've done here is actually resampled the data to make this a little more apparent, but this gets us to the point of these critical flow paths. So we see these regions with moderate to high flows ranging from yellow to blue that we understand are critical for the transport of the water throughout the system. So most of the precipitation falls in the upper part of the watershed here and moves down throughout the watershed, eventually leading out to the Indian Ocean itself. But with this map, we can see where these important flow locations are so that we can ensure that we don't recommend construction or other types of activities that might otherwise disrupt the flow of the water itself. And then lastly, I show this map of unmet demand. It's a bit difficult to see, but there's sort of a little bit of blue dots that you see scattered around the landscape. And these are the locations that we've identified as places where people don't have access to enough fresh water throughout the year. So based on our understanding of where the users are and the way that the water moves through the landscape itself, we can identify potential areas that might need some other type of assistance in terms of digging additional wells, maybe piping water, maybe accessing underground water if there is any, but basically putting places on the map where we know and understand that there are issues related to people's access to fresh water. So that's about the extent of where we are with that project. Again, this is project work that's ongoing. I'm in the process of looking at some different scenarios related to both climate and land cover change, both historic and future, to have a better understanding of where these types of water shortages might occur in the future. And we've got some colleagues that are primarily interested in the infectious disease side of the equation that are looking at, they're actually going out into the field and doing human health surveys, talking to specific households with repeat surveys to ask them about things like how they use water, how far they travel for water, what about in the dry season, how's the household health, these types of things. So we're looking eventually to put all of this together and get a better understanding of the relationship between people's access to water and the spread of infectious disease itself. A couple of publications if you're interested in a little bit more information about this. All right, moving on to my second and final example here. I'm going to talk about maybe something not quite as depressing as no water and infectious disease. In this case, looking at mineral resources, so particularly oil, gas, and potash development on public land in the United States and its relationship to recreational use of the landscape. And this is an effort that is part of what's known as the Moab Master Leasing Plan. So Moab, Utah is located in the southwestern United States. The Bureau of Land Management, BLM here for short, is tasked with the management of a large amount of public lands, primarily in the western United States. And a lot of the activity on that land relates to livestock grazing and the exploitation of mineral resources. So we were asked to participate in this project to contribute to the regional management plan itself, looking at about 950,000 acres in east central Utah. Now, the Bureau of Land Management has identified a number of places with quite outstanding views and high recreational values, as well as wilderness areas and high air quality locations that could potentially be threatened if we see a full build out of the oil and gas within the region. My project collaborators on this include the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Geological Survey, other colleagues from the University of Vermont, and finally the National Park Service. And I show this picture on the left and this picture as well because they sort of epitomize the issue with this current location. So this picture itself is taken from Arches National Park, one of the crown jewels of the American National Park system. Anybody ever been to Arches? Right? You can agree with me, it's not a bad place. The arch itself is in the national park. Everything we see beyond the arch is owned and managed by a different federal agency. Different interests, different management responsibilities, different types of access. And so we could think of going to this arch to see the natural beauty, looking through, and instead of just seeing that single little white blob, which is a location where they were building a natural gas well, the entire landscape covered with those white blobs or oil derricks moving up and down, and how that might affect the overall perception of the quality of the view or the quality of the landscape itself. So in terms of resource development, there have been expressions of interest, meaning companies have come in and expressed interest in developing about 120,000 acres of new oil and gas development and 350,000 acres of new potash development. So bumping up against about 500,000 acres out of the 950,000 acres within the entire management area itself. We looked at a number of different alternatives, a process that's currently ongoing, related to these different types of very distinct user groups. Hikers, mountain bikers, jeep safari, rafting, other types of access to the land that followed prescribed trail networks themselves. And we're looking to identify and support the designation of areas of critical environmental concern. So again, you can think of these as directly overlapping with these areas of critical flow that I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, as well as identifying potential conflict areas that could arise as a result of mineral development in the region. The graphic on the right, this image was taken from a place called Dead Horse Point State Park. It's just on the north side of the management area itself. And if you look at this long enough, you say, one of these things does not look like the other. That's not a big swimming pool that you see in the blue there. And while it might look somewhat interesting, what that actually is where they pump the slurry with potash and allow the water to evaporate and then leave the minerals that they can then go in and scoop up. So while some people might think that that adds an interesting dimension to the landscape, many folks that are out there for a true wilderness experience don't necessarily view that in such a positive light. Now, as part of this project, I'm working directly with the USGS and the BLM, and we're trying to figure out ways that we can incorporate ecosystem services into the decision-making and planning processes. And so we work together with the local field office, again, to build this set of source, sink, and use models related to the landscape and the particular resources that it has to offer, related to the aesthetic qualities that can be associated with recreation. And so we look at things like our land cover, our topography, and the presence of different types of landmarks themselves. And while we have data to support most of these intermediate nodes, those that we see in the central column right here, we are also tasked with looking at the possibilities for using national level data within the United States to support this type of modeling effort so that it could be transferred to other units within the BLM itself, or even for use at the state level by some state regulatory agencies. So we once again associate different data sets with the nodes of the Bayesian network itself, and we can tie those into the different types of data that we have access to. And again, the details here aren't totally important. Unless someone has questions, we can discuss those later. But for the most part, we're trying to draw on these national level data sets so that we can, again, make this model transferable to other regions and make it useful for something besides just this single project itself. So the source values relate to things like the actual aesthetics of the landscape, whereas the sink values, we're talking about visual blight, things that people don't want to see. So things like transportation networks, mining or energy infrastructure, high density development, these types of things that you're not going out to the national park to look at things that you could see almost anywhere else within America itself. So another example of a Bayesian network model that we're building to estimate the visual blight. Again, if we had a data layer that said, this is the visual blight throughout the United States, we could just use that data layer, but it's quite subjective, as you might imagine. I spent some time talking with Anthony and Allison and others yesterday about the different factors for their work related to aesthetic views up here in Quebec that maybe are very different from the type of things that we would concentrate on in a non-forested red rock geological system itself. And once again, we associate each of these different network nodes, the things that we see all the way on the left or in the middle, with particular data sets. And in this case, we had really good data at the national scale for something like development density, but some of these smaller features like roads and railroads and mining infrastructure that are not as well captured at the national scale, that we were fortunate that the state of Utah actually has a fairly good inventory of these types of things. So we can put all of these together to produce our sink model, or this estimation of visual blight. Now, in terms of the use model, I mentioned we had a number of different types of distinct users. Here's a more complete list. The map on the right shows the actual trail locations for different mountain biking. So there's people come from all over the world to mountain bike in Moab, in the Moab region. There's about 20 or 30,000 people that live in Moab, and more than 2 million visitors per year come to this place. So it's a fairly high quality landscape for a number of different recreational activities. And what we did was built a number of different computer algorithms to look at the scenic resources throughout the different trail networks for each of the different users that we see listed on the left. So we looked at viewsheds from about 9,000 distinct points on the landscape. And I'll show what that looks like here in a minute. And in terms of the flow model, because ARIES is still in development, it's a software project as much as it is an ecosystem services project. When I needed to produce some results for some initial model runs, I wasn't able to use ARIES to compute the flow models. So I built an interface within ArcGIS that I could plug in any number of these different national level data sets and use that to summarize the values for each of the different viewpoints. So the graphic that you see on the right is the model that I built within ArcGIS to make these types of computations. And that results in something that looks like this. So the study area is outlined in red. We have, in this case, a blue point that's highlighted as one of the national park locations, actually right where that picture of the arch was that I showed before. And all the green shading there represents the locations that can be seen from that particular viewpoint. So this process ran for all 9,000 different viewpoints throughout the region. And we're able to aggregate these values for individual uses in this particular case. For mountain biking trails, we see everything in yellow in the map on the left, indicating the viewsheds of the mountain bike trails themselves. And the map on the right represents this notion of viewshed density. So how frequently can certain areas be seen, certain areas of the landscape be seen from the existing trail network. So the red values in this case are really low, the green values really high. So the green values indicate that they can be seen from more different distinct locations throughout the trail network itself. So we summarize at the individual use level, again in this case mountain bikes, or we can compute everything in aggregate. So for all of the different use types summed up, we see that given the disparate number of recreational uses that we're interested in for the project, that we're covering almost the entire planning area with some sort of viewshed from one or more different activities. And then again, the map on the right-hand side shows this viewshed density once again, and we can see that there aren't a lot of areas with extremely high, so the yellow to green in terms of overall density, but quite a lot of areas that can be seen throughout the planning area itself. Now, those last two maps represented, two slides represented the sort of the initial effort. We passed that information on to the Bureau of Land Management, and they took that and used it to inform their planning process for where they would designate different types of activities as allowable. So these different stipulation types, oil and gas is permitted, potash is permitted, no surface occupancy. In other words, you can do things below ground, but you can't leave a noticeable footprint above ground. And they produced 4 different scenarios, including the status quo scenario itself. And from that, we were able to make some computations that we see on the right-hand side that indicate the amount of overlap between the viewsheds themselves and the different stipulation types. Again, whether or not you're able to make a surface disturbance, whether you're able to access something that's below ground, or potentially even completely closing off the area for any type of mineral development itself. So that's where we are with this project. This is information that has just been returned to the BLM folks for further investigation, and they're in the process now of crafting their final alternatives. So these are sort of interim temporary designation to see what the results might be from a comparison of how they designate allowable uses on the land and how we've identified the view sheds or the aesthetic resources that the different recreational enthusiasts are interested in. Next steps in terms of this process will be that the BLM will finalize their alternatives, we'll rerun this last analysis, and then these maps will be included in the overall master planning document itself. So, with that, I'd like to acknowledge a number of different collaborators from BC3, the USGS, the BLM, and other friends at the University of Vermont, as well as my funding from the U.S. Agency for International Development and the U.S. Geological Survey. And given that I'm from Vermont, and it is almost winter there too, I would be remiss to say this is what I like to do for recreation in the winter. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Brian, for your very interesting presentation and nice, interesting case studies. So, is there any questions for Brian? Mary?
Yeah, I was wondering what the political acceptance of the models that you are developing is. Are the people working with the people who are in power to make decisions, or is this more of a ecological mapping system? Are you able to put forward and get acceptance? Because I can imagine that the oil and gas and other mineral resource development have a huge power where you are.
Yeah, so for the Utah project specifically, so I'm working directly with the field office staff in Moab from the Bureau of Land Management, and they helped me to create those Bayesian models that I showed, the source and sink models themselves. They're the folks that are actually tasked with writing the management plan. So we worked in concert to develop the models, which helps then build a level of confidence that they have in what I'm producing, so for inclusion in the plan. Now, what the oil and gas lobby would think about that, I don't know. I doubt that they would be very excited to see that recreational view sheds cover most of the planning area. That being said, recreational enthusiasts have a fairly strong lobby in that place, in that location as well. So you can imagine that the folks that rent gear, that provide guiding services, hotels, restaurants, all these people that cater to the 2+ million people that come into their small town every year are very much reliant on that tourist economy. And so there's this concern that if oil and gas wins out, they'll come in, they'll take the resources and the money, and then they'll be gone within some shorter time frame than what the recreational opportunities might offer over a much, much longer time period. So it's an interesting case where maybe oil and gas won't win out outright because of the fact that there are a large number of people that benefit directly and indirectly from the tourism economy that's built into the system there. Yes, please.
In your use model, how you make valuation of the use system? It goes to economic analysis or some ecosystem service sustainability issues, or how it goes?
Sure. In the Tanzania example, we did not necessarily tie that to an economic value. If we were in a place where water rights were a little bit more well-defined, we could probably associate the amount of water that people receive with an actual price per liter or gallon of water itself. In the Utah example, we've had some discussion about looking at the impact on visitation rates, and so there's an understanding an estimate of the amount of money that different types of recreationists will spend for a visit. So if you're coming to Moab for mountain biking, you'll spend $250 a day. That might include things like lodging, gas, food, etc. So if we could take this one step further and project a change in visitation rates under the different scenarios that I showed, then we could associate that with some dollar value. There's been a little bit of reluctance from a number of different angles there to do something like that for this project, but hypothetically, that would be one way that you could address something like that. So if you understand how much somebody's willing to spend, or how much somebody actually does spend to come and engage in one of these activities, and you can make some reasonable projection of a change in visitation related to an activity, you could calculate some economic benefit or loss associated with the development or non-development of a resource.
When you're working in a place like Tanzania, Brian, and coming in to a culture that maybe hasn't talked a lot about ecosystem services or used that jargon, what kind of acceptance, a bit like the question of Mary too, what kind of acceptance do you find about talking about resources in that way? Or do you try to translate what you're doing into a more local way of understanding water use and conflicts, et cetera?
Good question. The parlance of ecosystem services, you're right, is not well understood within Tanzania itself. But what people do understand is that there's a problem with a lack of water. And so we do try to frame it in these terms. There's already been conflict between agricultural producers and livestock producers and the pastoral households in the downstream parts of the watershed. Unfortunately, everybody likes to blame everybody else for the problem, which is something that fortunately we're not tasked with sorting out necessarily, because I don't think there's any easy answers there. I mean, and that gets more into the politics of the topic than I was ever comfortable with, but framing it in terms of conflict, if you take water out of the system, that doesn't leave any water for Anthony or for myself. And people can understand that kind of relationship between the consumption of water in one place and the lack of availability in the other place. The other thing to mention is that in Tanzania, many people visit the northern part of Tanzania. They go to Kilimanjaro, they go and see the Serengeti, so they're up right along the Tanzania-Kenya border. It's basically being loved to death. There's too many people that are going there, and so from a regional economic perspective, they're trying to encourage tourism development in what's called the Southern Circuit, so around Ruaha National Park and the Selous Game Preserve, among other places. And so they understand that if there's not water in the southern part of the country to support both agriculture and tourism, that you're only going to be left with agriculture, and you're never, the sort of cycle of poverty will continue to repeat itself over and over. So it's not always easy. I mean, the communication piece is definitely challenging, but we addressed that, I guess, in sort of two ways. We had local collaborators from the Sokoine University, from the Friends of Ruaha, and a little bit of interaction with the district water managers. In addition to that, one of the things that we did on both of the trips while we were there was that I taught a one-week short course in GIS where I also tried to introduce some of these concepts. So I maybe am missing the current generation of managers and regulators, but we're trying to both provide spatial analysis skills and a new way to frame environmental problems for the next generation of managers and planners.
Another question? So thanks, Brian, for your presentation.
Thanks everyone for your time.